When Thomas was young, he had a woman he liked. When she divorced and returned to her home country, I was left forgotten in a heavy rainstorm. That day, I borrowed an umbrella from a passing janitor. I went to the airport and bought a ticket for the next available flight. I thought, anywhere is fine, as long as it's away from Thomas and Naomi. At 6 o'clock, Thomas's car returned home. The person who came out to greet him was the servant, not his wife. Sorry. Only then did Thomas remember that, worried about Naomi, he had forgotten to pick her up from the market. But it didn't matter. His wife was gentle and would never get upset over such small matters. By 7, the rain had stopped. It was very dark, and Zoe still had not returned. Thomas began to feel an inexplicable anxiety. He called her 3 times. The first call went unanswered. The second and third calls also failed to connect. The torrential rain had come suddenly, as if the sky had darkened in an instant. I clumsily ran to a nearby awning to escape the rain. I stared blankly at the pouring rain. An hour ago, Thomas had said he would come pick me up, but now, he was nowhere to be seen. The girls sheltering from the rain nearby were gradually picked up by their boyfriends or husbands, who tilted the umbrellas to cover them, taking care of them. I thought, Thomas must be taking care of Naomi in the same careful manner, the woman he liked when he was young. Later, they missed each other by a twist of fate. I heard she had suffered a lot after marriage. During these 3 months of divorce proceedings, Naomi's mother had also passed away. Thomas often worried so much that he couldn't sleep, sighing deeply, and today was the day Naomi finally managed to get divorced and return to her home country. In the morning, Thomas showered and changed into a new custom-made suit. The tie he wore had a subtle mandala pattern. After marriage, I took care of his daily needs, but that tie was not purchased by me. The rain continued endlessly, as lively as frying beans, but my heart seemed to suddenly become calm. Auntie, I said with a smile, waving to the passing janitor. I exchanged the newly bought seafood for her old umbrella. Seeing her so happy, I couldn't help but smile too. The umbrella was old but could shield from the wind and rain, better than a man who hadn't arrived. I left the market and hailed a taxi at the roadside. When I arrived at the airport, I realized that I had nowhere to go. I only had one grandmother left, but if I went to her, she would know I was distressed. In the end, I just bought a ticket for the next available flight. I thought, anywhere is fine, as long as it's away from Thomas and Naomi. In 3 years of marriage, Naomi had silently filled my life like care. I couldn't bear it anymore. Just before boarding the plane, my phone suddenly rang. It was Thomas calling. I thought for a moment and didn't answer. When the ringing stopped, I added his number to my blacklist. Thomas had returned home at 6 o'clock. When the car stopped, only the servant came out to greet him. He paused, took off his coat but didn't hand it to the servant, instead draping it over his arm. Where is my wife? Madam has not yet returned. Thomas stopped in his tracks. Only then did he remember that Zoe had gone to the market to buy fresh produce on a whim. He had promised to pick her up to come home together, but Naomi had fainted in front of her mother's grave. In his rush to take Naomi to the hospital, he had forgotten to pick her up. Thomas glanced at the torrential rain outside. He felt the pang of guilt. Would Zoe be angry? But as soon as this thought arose, Thomas shook his head with a smile. He had never seen anyone with a gentler, more generous temperament than his wife. She would never get angry over such trivial matters. Sir, I see you got wet in the rain. You should go up and take a hot bath, the servant gently reminded him. Thomas nodded. If my wife returns, tell her I'm upstairs. He went upstairs and took a hot bath. For some reason, he felt a bit unsettled during the bath. When he came out of the bathroom, he felt a bit congested. He wanted to take some cold medicine, but couldn't find the medicine cabinet. Thomas checked the time. It was nearly 7, and Zoe still hadn't come back. The rain outside seemed to have stopped, but it was even darker. He took out his phone and called Zoe. The phone rang for a long time without being answered until he finally hung up. Thomas frowned. This was unprecedented. Zoe never missed his calls. Maybe the heavy rain caused traffic problems, or a minor accident on the road. Thomas felt his heart tighten suddenly. He quickly dialed again, but the call that had gone through earlier now failed. His brows furrowed deeper, his face gradually grew cold, but he patiently dialed a third time. Still no connection. He stood there holding his phone for a while. Then, he randomly searched online. Oh, it turned out that in such cases, the caller was probably on the recipient's blacklist. Thomas suddenly laughed in anger. He thought he should retract the statement about never having seen a more gentle and generous person than his wife. When the plane landed in that unfamiliar city, it was already late at night. With the signal restored, new messages trickled in on my phone. I noticed several texts from an unknown number. Hello Zoe, this is Naomi. I heard that you and Thomas were upset because of me, and that you haven't been home. I'm worried and very sorry. I think I need to explain the situation between Thomas and me. He did like me, but that was a long time ago. Thomas always called me sister, and I regarded him as a younger brother. Seeing that there is a rift between you two because of me is truly not what I wanted. No one wishes more for Thomas to be happy than I do. Sorry. After you receive my message, could you please call Thomas back, or at least let us know that you are safe? I found it amusing. If she was really worried about my safety, there were countless ways to find out. With Thomas's family background, finding my personal information would be easy. But right after I left home, it wasn't the police who first looked for me. It was Naomi. I was really fed up. Naomi seemed to learn about every little disturbance in my life almost immediately. I didn't reply, but Naomi was persistent and called again. I answered the call. There was silence on the other end. After a moment, Naomi's voice came through, followed by a soft, mocking laugh. So, you're not as good as Thomas said you were. Quite a bit of patience to only start causing trouble after 3 years. Sorry. Naomi suddenly called my name. Since you're willing to step aside, I'll make sure Thomas gives you more alimony. I smiled. You've been divorced once and gone through a tough divorce trial. I suppose you're quite experienced. So, thank you for your efforts. If the settlement is good, I'll treat you to coffee. With that, I hung up the phone directly. Then, I blocked the number and set up a filter for all unknown calls. On the third day after Zoe left home, Thomas called her grandmother, who was thousands of miles away. After some pleasantries, he tentatively mentioned, "Grandmother, Zoe said a few days ago that she wanted to visit you. No need to come back. I'm fine. Don't bother with such a long trip." Thomas held the phone tightly, on the large terrace, watching the setting sun, and his heart seemed to sink with that sun. He knew Zoe had only one relative left, so he naturally assumed she must be sulking and had temporarily gone to her grandmother's place. But she hadn't gone. So, where had Zoe gone these past few days? He turned around and saw the familiar vanity. The vanity was as clean as ever, but her hairbrush was left out. He picked it up, finding a few long hairs tangled in it. Zoe's hair was very beautiful and black, never dyed or permed. He held the brush, lost in thought. Naomi's second call snapped him back to reality. "Thomas, I just passed by your garden and saw that the roses have wilted." Naomi's voice was gentle as it came through. "Have the gardener cleared them away? They look terrible." "No need." He refused Naomi outright for the first time. Naomi seemed surprised but quickly responded, "Thomas, are you angry?" "Yes, this is your and Zoe's home, so you have the final say." Naomi's voice trailed off with a hint of sobbing. Thomas's heart softened again. "That's not what I meant. Sister, has Zoe still not returned?" "No, it's my fault. I shouldn't have come back." Naomi started crying softly. Thomas listened to the faint crying and felt inexplicably irritated. Zoe rarely cried, only on their wedding night. Because of pain, did he hold her while she cried for a while? And the first year of their marriage, he missed her birthday. It seemed at that time, it was because Naomi's husband was abusive, and Thomas was too worried and went abroad overnight. Thomas felt oddly agitated. In 3 years of marriage, he had never known Zoe to have such a stubborn and willful side. He sat on the edge of the bed. After much thought, he decided to call Zoe's only close friend, The friend was surprised and said she hadn't received any calls from Zoe. Zoe hadn't gone to her city either. When Thomas hung up, his hands were trembling a bit. He lit a cigarette but didn't smoke. Zoe had a bit of a cleanliness obsession. When she was at home, every corner of the house was spotless. The phone rang again, but it was an unknown landline. He would normally never answer such calls, but this time, he answered it immediately. Hello. His voice trembled a bit. Thomas, it's me, Zoe. For some reason, when Zoe's familiar voice came through, Thomas, who was usually reserved and taciturn, was uncharacteristically sharp. Zoe, you're not a child anymore. Is running away from home a mature thing for someone your age? Do you know the negative impact it has on the family? I'm sorry. Thomas clutched the phone and loosened his tie, but he felt the heavy weight on his chest suddenly lift. If you know your mistake, come back quickly. His tone softened a little. Thomas, I have other things to discuss. What things? I've sent you something. By now, it should have arrived. Why send something? You could have brought it back when you came home. Zoe's tone remained gentle and calm. I'm not coming home. Please check the delivery and sign for it. If you have no objections, sign it. I'll call you again in 2 days. This call is from someone else's phone. Don't call again. I won't be able to answer. Sorry. What do you mean? Thomas felt his previously relaxed heart tighten again. Thomas, being married to you for 3 years, I've been a bit unhappy. So, let's get a divorce. Thomas was silent. Zoe was also silent, seemingly politely waiting for his response. Where are you now? That's not important. Thomas looked out at the darkening evening. Zoe, what are you throwing a tantrum for? On the other end of the line, Zoe didn't say another word. She seemed to laugh softly. Then, she hung up. Thomas almost instinctively redialed immediately, but the person who answered was a stranger. She spoke in a dialect Thomas couldn't understand. He could only apologize and hang up. The dusk fell heavily, and he sat still in that heavy twilight. In 3 years of marriage, Zoe was like a glass of always lukewarm water. She never got angry, never had tantrums. She always spoke in a soft voice. Everyone liked her and praised her, so much so that he almost forgot. Their marriage had started as a quarrel between elders, and someone who could secure the position of the family's eldest daughter-in-law with such trivial favors. How could she be as gentle and harmless as she appeared? With no scheming? Thomas turned and walked to the vanity, placing the brush he had been holding down. He saw himself in the mirror. His brows were furrowed, and his eyes held a storm of anger, and he had always been emotionally restrained. Yet now, he was stirred by this trivial matter. Thomas quickly composed himself, regaining his usual impassive expression. He walked out of the master bedroom and downstairs. Naomi called him from the downstairs living room, and he merely responded with a faint acknowledgement. He asked the servant to bring the package received today. Thomas picked out the letter from Zoe, opened it. Naomi, standing by, gasped softly. Thomas expressionlessly tore up the divorce agreement and threw it into the trash can. Thomas. Naomi stepped forward, gently tugging at his sleeve, and spoke softly. Don't be angry. Zoe must have acted out of impulse. She's always gentle and understanding. It's probably my fault. If I hadn't come back and caused you these troubles, she wouldn't have been so upset. Thomas's voice was slightly cold. What does it have to do with you? It's her own fault. Isn't it because you indulge her that she's acting out? Naomi forced a smile. I've heard a lot about your loving marriage while abroad. Before she could finish, she suddenly burst into tears. Thomas sneered. Why did I marry her? Others might not know. But surely you do? Naomi looked at him with tears in her eyes. Thomas, was it really because of me? Thomas didn't answer, only gently pulled his sleeve away. I need to go out. Should I have the driver take you back? Or will you stay here? Naomi wiped her tears. I'll stay here and wait for you. With you and Zoe fighting like this, I won't be able to sleep if I go back. Thomas nodded, instructing the servant to prepare the guest room. He also asked the driver to get the car ready before turning to leave. Naomi watched him leave. She glanced at the torn-up divorce agreement in the trash can. She pursed her lips and slowly sat down on the sofa. Why did Thomas tear up the divorce agreement? It seemed he had no intention of divorcing Zoe at all. On the day I left, I knew finding someone's whereabouts was as easy as pie for Thomas. It all depended on whether he wanted to or not. So, when I saw Thomas downstairs at the guest house, I wasn't too surprised. In the early autumn weather, he was wearing a light grey thin trench coat, leaning against the car, smoking. He was handsome and tall, attracting attention with every move. In contrast, I appeared quite ordinary, in a loose cotton linen dress, with my long hair casually tied up with a handkerchief, without makeup, carrying a grocery bag. I looked more like a housemaid from a family home. When I first married him, I often felt inadequate in comparison. But now, I've come to terms with it. Just like a simple home-cooked dish will never make it to a luxurious banquet table. Thomas and I were a mistake from the very beginning. He stubbered out his cigarette and looked at me with a neutral expression. I also put down the shopping bag I was holding. Thomas glanced at his watch, and when he spoke, his voice was as cold as ever. Pack up your things. 30 minutes should be enough. Did you sign it? I extended my hand to him. Give me the divorce agreement, and I'll go with you to finalize the paperwork. Thomas's indifferent eyes showed no emotion. They were just a shade darker. Now is not the right time to announce our divorce. Then we won't make it public yet. Just finalize the paperwork. Sorry. You know the company's anniversary celebration is next week. You need to attend with me. Thomas gave a slight smirk, with a hint of mockery in his smile. Your timing for making a fuss is impeccable, but you should understand that I'm not someone who can be easily manipulated. I remained silent, just quietly watching Thomas. We had done the most intimate things a married couple could do. Yet, men can easily separate sex from love. Women, however, cannot. The rain didn't drench my body, but it soaked my heart. But Thomas would never understand that, because he never loved me. If you sign the divorce papers, I'll attend the anniversary celebration with you next week. I can cooperate with anything the company needs. I looked at him, even smiling gently as I used to. Thomas, this doesn't harm you in any way. Fine. He looked at me for a long time before finally nodding. After the company's anniversary celebration next week, I'll sign the papers. I didn't return with Thomas. I only took the opportunity to go back to Beijing the day before the company's anniversary celebration, to avoid gossip and rumors about our marriage ending. I was picked up from the airport by his car. When I got out, Naomi greeted me like the lady of the house. Sorry, you're finally back. She hurried over, took my hand, and with red eyes, shed a few tears. I looked at her calmly. Her clothes, jewelry, and makeup were clearly carefully prepared. It was understated yet luxurious, just like how the wives and daughters of wealthy families dress when hosting guests in their homes. I didn't speak, only withdrew my hand from hers. Naomi had done a beautiful manicure, with a gemstone ring and a diamond ring on her pale fingers, but I had nothing on my hands. I had already taken off my wedding ring. There was even a thin callus on my palm. When I first learned of Naomi's existence, I used to foolishly compare myself to her in my mind. But now, no matter how beautiful and elegant she is, I felt not a single ripple in my heart. I didn't look at her again or respond. I walked past her, carrying my bag. Naomi bit her lip awkwardly. A servant came over to take my things. Madam, let me carry it. I smiled and stepped away. No need. The servant didn't dare say more and looked at Thomas with some embarrassment. Let her be. Thomas looked away and headed towards the main house. But I didn't go with him to the main house. Instead, I went to the guest house. Sorry. Thomas was finally angry. Perhaps it was the presence of the many servants that made my actions especially awkward for him and Naomi. I didn't stop or respond. I had no desire to communicate with Thomas. I only wanted the anniversary celebration to end as soon as possible. Then, our marriage could end quickly as well. When Thomas and I entered the banquet hall hand in hand, the atmosphere was at its peak. He was the considerate husband, and I was the gentle and praised wife as usual. While mingling, he held my hand tightly. From time to time, he would glance at me with a gentle expression, I would also look down and smile. But before, that smile was genuinely shy and happy. Now, it was masked with pretense. I despised this version of myself and loathed him even more. I just hoped for it to end quickly. But by the end of the dinner, a sashimi dish was placed in front of me. The faint smell of fish made my stomach churn. I excused myself to the restroom in a hurry and vomited until I was dizzy. When I got up, I felt faint and lost consciousness. When I opened my eyes again, I was in the hospital. Many family members had arrived, and Thomas was sitting by my bed. He held my hand with an unusually happy expression. "Sorry, do you know, you're pregnant, just over 45 days. His voice was soft and warm, almost as if afraid to startle me. At that moment, I felt a bit disoriented. Thomas rarely showed such tenderness. 3 years had passed in the blink of an eye, and there had been only a few such moments. And in those 3 years, Thomas and Naomi had met very few times, but each time, he was exceptionally gentle. It was only because he liked Naomi, and the gentleness he showed me was never for me. No, it was only for the baby in my womb. Grandma already knows about your pregnancy." He held my hand, and his smile was gentle. "I've sent someone to bring her here. She's very happy," she cried with excitement on the phone. I lay in bed, suddenly crying as well. The 3 years of marriage without a pregnancy had been a concern for Grandma, but she never knew that I wasn't pregnant because Thomas didn't want a child. He wanted to enjoy a few more years of just the two of us. He had always been very careful about contraception, but why was he so happy now? After the family left, the room quieted down. Thomas brought me water. "Let's not discuss the divorce anymore. Take care of yourself and the baby." I pushed away the glass of warm water. "I don't want this baby." Thomas's expression didn't change at all. He looked down at me from above. "You can tell Grandma yourself, if you're willing to let her at her age be upset for you." Thomas was sure that I would continue to endure for Grandma's sake. But he forgot. When Grandma was young, she had the courage to fight against foot binding and her parents. She had dared to break off an engagement and run away to seek relatives 1,000 miles away. When her husband became addicted to drugs, she had divorced him decisively and secretly taken away her only daughter. Now that she was old, appearing fragile and peaceful, I knew that if Grandma knew about my situation with Thomas, she would support all my decisions. Thomas put aside all company matters. He focused on taking care of me. My fainting at the anniversary celebration and the news of my pregnancy had spread widely. Reporters and media were blocking the hospital. On the day I was discharged, the family's reception was grand. Everyone said I was lucky, marrying into the Gu family with such a background, a caring husband, and having a baby was considered winning in life. It's laughable how people evaluate a woman's success often based on the bonuses provided by men. No one cares about her own qualities. No one is concerned about how turbulent her actual life is. Naomi has already left Beijing. She has to return to live with her maternal grandparents. In the car, Thomas held my hand. "I told you from the start that there was nothing romantic between Naomi and me. We grew up together. When we were young, she injured her forehead saving me, and she still has a scar. I liked her when I was a child, and now I just see her as a sister. Sorry, you really shouldn't be so concerned about such trivial matters. However, since you care, I will pay attention in the future. I won't meet Naomi privately anymore, nor will I have any other interactions with her." Thomas held my shoulder, trying to pull me into his embrace. "Let's end things here. Now that we have a child, we should live happily as a family of 3. Okay." At that moment, I almost believed him. I had heard that when a woman is pregnant, she secretes a hormone. That hormone makes her reluctant to harm the tiny embryo in her womb. Over these days, I had been conflicted, troubled, and wavering. Grandma had also told me, a husband can be someone else's, but a child is always your own. Honestly, at that moment, I considered, maybe discovering the pregnancy now is a chance for me and Thomas. No woman wants to harm her own child. I'm no exception. But just as I was wavering, Naomi found a way to contact me. "Do you know why Thomas suddenly stopped using contraception 6 months ago?" I was taken aback. It did seem like he had stopped using contraception around that time. Because I decided to get a divorce then. You might think that since I decided to get a divorce, Thomas should be more careful with contraception. Naomi suddenly laughed. Her laugh was harsh and a bit desolate. Sorry, I can't have children. If I could, Thomas wouldn't have agreed to marry you. So do you understand how your baby came to be? He only brought this child into the world to pave the way for me. I shouldn't have told you this now. I should have waited until the child was born. But sorry, her voice was filled with vengeful hatred. I've changed my mind. I'd rather destroy this path than have you give birth to Thomas's child. I sat there, feeling a deep chill. That coldness seemed to spread from my feet to my entire body in an instant. Yet, I didn't cry. Instead, I felt an inexplicable sense of relief. I clearly sensed that all the emotions and attachments I had for Thomas were finally released. Have you ever thought about what would happen if I decided to keep the baby despite your words? You're not that kind of person. You seem gentle, tolerant, and forgiving, but your eyes can't tolerate even a grain of sand. I suddenly laughed. Naomi, thank you for telling me all this. Sorry, don't hate me. I just love him too much. You know, love is always selfish and blind. I didn't respond, ended the call, stood up, and walked to the window. In the twilight garden, the rose petals had almost all fallen. A breeze blew, and the last petals on the branches fell into the soil. The flowers had fallen, and the dream should have ended completely. The last time Thomas had dinner with Zoe, she wore a light green dress. The dress seemed familiar. After a moment of thought, he remembered she had worn a similar one when they first met. At that time, he had fought against his family and failed. Naomi had gone abroad in despair. He had met Zoe out of obligation, looking for an excuse to dismiss her. The harsh and cruel words he said only began to come out. She had already started to cry. Thomas had never seen a girl cry so much. Her eyes were large, and the tears gathered in her eyes. They fell slowly one by one. She choked as she said, "I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I didn't know you were forced to meet me. I'll go back and tell my elders to cancel our engagement." She cried in embarrassment because of his harsh words. Yet she kept apologizing. Thomas watched her stand up, accidentally spilling coffee. The coffee stain ruined her light green dress. She looked down and wiped it away, tears falling one by one. For some reason, his heart was slightly moved, thinking of the hopeless romance, thinking of Naomi who was getting married. He felt the kind of resigned drifting. "You're Zoe, right?" She was startled for a moment, then nodded. "Yes. Do you want to marry me?" She clutched the hem of her dress, pressed her lips together. Her long, thick eyelashes fell, covering her slightly reddened eyes. She nodded lightly. Her face flushed. "Then let's get married." She suddenly widened her eyes, shocked and surprised. But you just... He smiled and leaned back in his chair, lazily looking at her. Few family descendants were all quite good-looking. Moreover, he was still young and somewhat frivolous at that time. When he looked at her and smiled, she blushed deeply. "I was just teasing you. Sorry. Don't go back and tell my grandmother." She hurriedly shook her head. "No, I won't tell her." Then, her ears turned completely red, and she dared not look at him again. After the date, he took her home. When they got out of the car, he held her hand. 3 months later, they were engaged. 7 months later, she married him. And now, after 3 years of marriage, she was pregnant with their child. Thomas felt the strange emotion bubbling inside him. The child had arrived as planned. He should be happy, but the happiness seemed to have other meanings. In recent days, he often wondered, would the child be a boy or a girl? Of course, a boy would be best, but if it's a girl, and she looks like Zoe, it wouldn't be bad either. But why does he hope the child looks like Zoe? His original plan was for the child to call Naomi Mom. Thomas vaguely felt that some things were starting to slip out of control. But strangely, he didn't want to pull back. He oddly wanted to let it all go out of control. That day's dinner was prepared by Zoe herself. She didn't experience morning sickness that day and was in good spirits, so he let her take charge. She even drank a little fruit wine. which was harmless for pregnant women. When he was a bit tipsy, he thought Zoe looked especially beautiful. Did you put on makeup? Just a little. The lipstick color is very pretty. Thank you. She smiled with her eyes slightly squinted. He smiled too. He stood up, walked behind her, and rested his hands on the armrests of her chair. Thomas lowered his head, his high nose brushing against her thick hair. It was an intimate moment. Shall I have the servants move your things back to the master bedroom? She didn't nod or shake her head. She just lifted her glass and clinked it with his. Later, he took her for a walk in the garden. The moon was bright, and the grass was covered with a layer of slightly withered rose petals. She was very quiet during the walk. Only the early autumn breeze brushed against the hem of her long dress. Thomas followed behind her, suddenly feeling a bit drunk. He thought the scene looked very peaceful and pleasant. He couldn't quite remember if she went back to the master bedroom. He was deeply asleep for a long time. When he woke up, it was already noon the next day. He turned over and instinctively reached out to the side of the bed. Zoe. His hangover made his head ache. He struggled to sit up. The bedroom was empty. There was only one pillow on the big bed. She hadn't stayed over last night, and Thomas hadn't known at that time. Not just last night. From now on, Zoe would never return here. When he came out of surgery, Grandma was waiting outside to pick me up. I was wrapped in a thick coat, yet still shivering with cold. As the anesthesia wore off, a dull pain started in my lower abdomen. Grandma placed a hot water bottle on my belly and held my hand tightly. Zoe, let's go home with Grandma. Her body was slightly hunched, and her legs were bent, but her hands were still warm and strong. It felt like she gave me immense courage to move forward. I told their family from the beginning that we didn't want any repayment. Grandma understands the principles of righteousness better than anyone. Now that it's come to this, Grandma doesn't blame anyone, just feels sorry for you. I leaned against Grandma's shoulder and pouted. If you feel sorry for me, then make me a bowl of egg custard. It's been so long since I had one of Grandma's egg custards. From now on, Grandma will make one for you every day. I supported Grandma, and she helped me along. The midday sun warmed us, and I finally felt some warmth. When we reached the hospital entrance, I saw Thomas's car. He got out of the car, his face stern, lips pressed into a thin line. Grandma instinctively tried to shield me, but I shook my head gently. Thomas strode up to me and grabbed my shoulder. Zoe, where is the baby? I terminated it. How could you? How could you? Zoe. He gripped my shoulders, his fingers tightening. I saw his pale, iron-gray face. His eyes churned with anger and pain. Does it hurt? It should. I pried his fingers off one by one. Please sign the papers and finalize the divorce. I won't divorce you. Thomas's voice was cold, each word pronounced carefully. I was a bit surprised but didn't have much of an emotional reaction. Then let's go to court, if you want to make a fuss about it. The so-called beautiful story of the past has become a joke for idle chatter. I smiled indifferently. Then I'll play along. Thomas wanted to say more, but his phone suddenly rang. I vaguely heard Naomi's name. Then his expression changed. Got it? I'm coming over right away, he answered urgently. After hanging up, he looked at me and said, Zoe, wait for me to come back. We need to talk. But I didn't wait for him to come back and talk. I went straight to Hannah. I didn't hide anything or add any embellishments. I just repeated exactly what Naomi had said. Hannah couldn't accept Naomi's infertility back then. She played the role of the villain who broke up the couple. Under the pressure from the elders, she had to reluctantly accept me as her daughter-in-law. Over the past 3 years, she had been lukewarm towards me but not unkind. When she learned I was pregnant, she was actually very happy. But now, her grandchild was gone. I thought, even if she hated me, she would hate Naomi even more. Naomi wanted to reconcile with Thomas. It seemed she would never get past Hannah's hurdle. Naomi had a point. I'm not at all generous. I'm very petty. I hope the people I like only have eyes for me. I also hope that those who hurt me never find happiness in their lives, because they never had any pity or remorse when they hurt innocent people. Hannah was a very decisive woman, just like how she decisively broke up Naomi and Thomas back then, forcing Naomi to marry far away. Now she acted again. Thomas and I quickly finalized our legal divorce, and Naomi, under Hannah's relentless measures, faced immense pressure and was forced to remarry. I heard she even attempted suicide. Thomas stayed with her in the hospital for a day and a night. I also heard that Thomas was determined to marry Naomi. Hannah was so furious that she slapped him twice and tried to expel him from the family. But none of this concerned me anymore. I went back with Grandma to the small county 1,000 miles away. I renovated and tidied up Grandma's small courtyard, planning to plant a garden full of roses in the spring next year. When I was just out of my confinement, Thomas suddenly came. Grandma didn't open the gate. He stayed outside for a long time, leaving only in the early hours of the morning. The next morning, when I went out to get milk, I saw him again. In the early winter weather, he wore only a thin coat, while I was wrapped in one of Grandma's cotton robes. You see, we are always like people from two different worlds. The neighbors curiously stared at him, stopping in their tracks. After all, it's rare to see such a handsome and wealthy gentleman in our small county. But I glanced at him once and then looked away. I was once attracted to his appearance in my youth and foolishly married him. But marriage is like drinking water. Only you know whether it's warm or cold. The path I chose, I accept and recognize. Thomas didn't say anything, but he followed me all the way. I got the milk, bought breakfast, and turned back. He followed all the way until I reached the courtyard gate. Sorry, he finally spoke, calling my name. I didn't stop. I pushed open the gate and prepared to close it. Thomas stepped forward and blocked the gate with his hand. Sorry, Naomi is getting married next spring. I don't think I've ever lost my temper as an adult, not even when arguing with others. But this time, I suddenly acted out. I poured the warm milk over his face. His expensive coat and cashmere sweater were stained. He looked surprised, frowning tightly. Zoe. Thomas, if the person she is marrying next spring is you, I'd still respect you as a man. But now, it seems you don't love her that much. After all, if you could give up your family inheritance, you could marry her. And you can't there too. Zoe's words were only half true. He really didn't love Naomi that much. But not because he couldn't give up his inheritance. He just truly no longer felt the same way about her as he did when he was young. After Zoe got pregnant, Thomas had considered it. The three of them could live a good life together. The dirty and despicable thoughts he once had would stay buried in his heart forever. He once crossed the line with Naomi out of sympathy and pity in a foreign land. In a moment of impulse, he made promises about children and marriage to Naomi, but he had regretted it a long time ago. But Naomi told Zoe, and she had unhesitatingly terminated the pregnancy. And when he learned the baby was gone, Thomas only had one thought in his heart. That was, he couldn't keep Zoe. Just like roses, once they fall, they are gone. But in their marital home, Zoe was still everywhere. The servants often spoke of the madam and what she liked, what she would have wanted to know. And himself, every time he came home at 6, even though he knew she had long since left, he still hoped it would be her coming to greet him. He once thought Zoe was like a bland, always 45 degrees warm water, an insignificant presence. That how can a person live without water? He often thought of their last dinner, her face after drinking a little fruit wine. The color of the lipstick she wore that day was beautiful. He often wondered if he had held her hand during their later walk, if he had hugged her from behind, if he had softly called her wife, would she have softened and given him another chance? He also often thought if he hadn't forgotten to pick her up that rainy day, if he had appeared in front of her in time, would the story's ending have been completely different? But talking about these things was meaningless. He could only tell himself to look forward. Zoe was still single. Zoe refused many suitors. Zoe had once loved him very much. He would go to see her 2 or 3 times a year. But on his 9th visit, the same story played out again. But this time, the male lead was no longer him. That day the rain was heavy, just like the time he forgot to pick her up. But this time, the male lead didn't make the same mistake he did. In the pouring rain, the man's car was parked steadily. Zoe was sheltering from the rain under the eaves. Seeing the car come, she wanted to run over to get in, but the man waved his hand repeatedly to stop her. He first got out into the rain, soaked through to get an umbrella, then quickly walked to her, holding the umbrella almost entirely over her, helping her into the car. It was a very short distance, only 2 or 3 steps, but the man couldn't bear to let her get even a bit wet. Preferring to be drenched in the rain himself, Thomas sat in the car, staring blankly at the scene. The windshield wipers moved rapidly. The entire world seemed to be swallowed by the heavy rain. The car carrying Zoe sped away, never to be seen again. And that heavy rain from years ago, the rain he forgot to pick Zoe up in, fell on him like a torrential downpour much later. Thomas smiled bitterly. He started the car and turned it around. The car sped through the dense rain like an arrow. For a moment, he seemed to see the young and naive Zoe from before. Back then, when they were newly engaged, his mother disliked her, but his grandmother liked her very much. During the engagement, his grandmother had said, "Zoe, if Thomas bullies you, come and tell Grandma. Grandma will back you up." So back then, every time she was shy from his teasing, she would say, "I'm going to tell Grandma." He couldn't help but smile. He also remembered their wedding night. She cried from pain, and he comforted her, jokingly saying, "Why don't you go tell Grandma?" She cried and laughed, angrily biting him. He kissed her as she closed her eyes obediently beneath him. Thomas finally understood. When he first met Zoe, he had already fallen for her. But sadly, people often sigh and regret when the flowers fall. And when the flowers are in full bloom, they are not cherished and valued as they should be. In the 2nd year after Zoe and he divorced, the roses in their marital home had all withered. But in the small town 1,000 miles away, Grandma's courtyard was full of blooming roses. But those beautiful flowers no longer belonged to him. Thomas suddenly looked up. He feared he might embarrassingly shed tears in this pouring rain. In Zoe's new life that had already begun, the story is over. Feel free to subscribe to the channel to get the latest updates. We update a lot of novels every day.